Hello and welcome to my presentation. I'm going to explore the influence of cultural policy on the field of community music. So to provide an overview, I'll talk about the context behind this study and the research I'm currently undertaking. I'll then begin to talk specifically around the areas of language policy in community music, and I'll draw from some of the thematic areas in my research regarding the influence of funders before providing a brief summary. Community music has often been considered on the fringes of UK cultural policymaking. Recognised as an emancipatory and activistic practice, it opposed many of the institutionalised systems that were embedded within society. Yet significant changes in the way that projects are now being developed and run have led to practitioners considering if community music has lost its activistic roots and is now working with the governmental systems it once opposed. One such system which community music has been caught up within is that of cultural policy, which can be understood as a subset of policy primarily concerned with the actions and governance taken by governmental bodies around the consequences and conditions of culture. It's more than just a policy or writing on paper, but can be understood as the systems that are set up to support arts and cultural activity, such as funding bodies. Sophie Hope, a scholar in socially engaged arts practice, for instance, describes how funding bodies have become a cornerstone for working towards governmental agendas. These are often cultural, but also economic and social, and funding bodies often disseminate funding for projects that have broader outcomes than just cultural participation. A prime example is that of Youth Music, who funds music programs, but at the heart of these programs lie a mixture of social, personal, and cultural impact. For Hope, this has led community arts and as a result, community music becoming developed into what she describes as socially engaged arts practice, whereby programs and projects developed in line with funders rather than the traditional model of developing projects in a grassroots community approach. For this presentation, I will be primarily considering this aspect of cultural policy in terms of funders. It has been highlighted as the most dominant feature in community music and community arts. In this research, I begin to explore the relationship between community music and cultural policy through examining three concepts highlighted as being critical to the discourse of community musicians. That's ownership, empowerment, and transformation. To explore these concepts, I employ a case study strategy examining three music programs, and I employ a range of methodological approaches, including focus groups and interviews in which to explore these three concepts. I also undertake a critical discourse analysis to explore three prominent publication platforms and to explore how these concepts have been employed and how that's changed and developed. At the heart of this research was the removal of any form of advocacy, or what Eleonora Belfiore puts as the removal of bullshit, where the research is not advocating for the impact of the work, but rather taking a critical lens in which to explore the field. So throughout this research, I'm not exploring or advocating for the impact of community music's work, but more looking at why we choose to use specific terms and where the influence for using these terms may have emerged from. I've chosen to explore language as I understand the influence and impact that phrases and terms can have within society. Andrea Cornwell and Deborah Eade talk about the influence of buzzwords in society. These are the sorts of terms or phrases that can influence funding. Within the arts and cultural sector, these are categorised as the sorts of terms that funders and policymakers use to demonstrate impact or value of work. The influence of such terms within the field has led to what Clive Gray has highlighted as policy attachment becoming part of the everyday normal for artists and cultural institutions who employ specific terms or phrases to demonstrate the impact of their work to funders. The most prevalent point of policy attachment has been highlighted by several scholars as New Labour's successful campaign in 1997, which saw arts and cultural activity employed as a critical feature within their social inclusion policy, and funding bodies instrumentalising arts and cultural funding for economic and social benefits on a level that had not been seen for quite some time. Through undertaking a critical discourse analysis on three publication platforms, so the sounding board journals, the ISME CMA proceedings, and the International Journal of Community Music, I was able to see the influence that the election of New Labour was having on the discourse of community music and the prevalence that funding bodies had had. For instance, prior to 1997, ownership and empowerment seemed to be critical buzzwords within the discourse of community musicians, with little mention of the idea of transformation. Community musicians were actively describing their projects through the ideas of ownership and empowerment and aiming to achieve facets of ownership throughout their work. Yet by 1998, the idea of transformation had begun to take over somewhat, and no longer were ownership and empowerment appearing to be worthy within their own right, but they're now being employed as a critical facet of aiding transformation that was built around the idea that music making could offer some form of life-changing experience. And this appeared to be in line with the work of funders who were working in partnership with government, such as Youth Music or Arts Council England, who were also beginning to describe the impact of participation in arts and cultural activity as being empowering or transformational. The idea of ownership had become lost somewhat. However, exploring it through the reading wasn't enough. I had to go off and discuss it and see it through my own lives through project. Cue my conversation with Mason from the Music Spark programme and Julie from the Loud and Clear programme. Both facilitators were working for a large cultural institution where their programme was being funded by a prominent funding body within the UK. Across both of their conversations, they highlight instances of feeling pressure to employ empowerment or transformation in their language surrounding their project, because they believe that the funder would want to see and conceptualize the impact of their work within this way. Julie, for instance, described how she would employ terms such as transformation because that was the sort of meaty term that funders would like to see, and that could demonstrate the impact of their work in a way that they would understand. It's worth noting here that Julie didn't actually agree with the term transformation. It wasn't the term that she would have chosen to have used, but yet she felt pressured to have used them. And yet this wasn't an isolated instance, because looking towards the other two case studies, it was clear that that pressure facilitators and program managers to employ these terms to demonstrate the impact of their work to funders was definitely being felt. Not only that, but across the three projects, it became clear the influence that funders had on the approaches that facilitators and organisations were taking to develop, set up, and evaluate projects. All three case studies had already set predetermined outcomes that they hoped to achieve through their programme of activity, and that had been decided on in partnership with funders. The majority of these outcomes were centred around the social benefits that become prominent in the discourse of community musicians, and they were deemed as being transformational. With such an emphasis on achieving these outcomes, the project delivery and evaluation methods are being built around finding ways to demonstrate the meeting of these outcomes, or at least finding a way to showcase that they've taken a step towards meeting them to highlight value for money. Take Melody from Music Spark's comments. She again described feeling pressured to try and find moments of empowerment and transformation through the evaluation procedures that were in the Music Spark programme. So she was specifically talking around the reflection diary. And she believed that the organisation that she worked for had specifically worded or prompted, used words or phrases that would prompt her to employ the term transformation and empowerment within her reflection diaries to demonstrate the impact of their work, even if she didn't want to employ them herself. So to summarise, in just this very short overview of a 3-year, 4-year research project, to summarise, it appears that cultural policy and community music are intrinsically connected through the ways in the last 3 decades that the funding presence has really taken over within the field. Through this presentation, I've highlighted the impact that funders are appearing to have on influencing the sorts of language that's been employed by musicians and cultural organisations, and in turn how programmes are being set up and developed. I've highlighted the ideas that health and wellbeing discourse, specifically that idea of transformation and empowerment, have become a cornerstone to the language of community musicians, which has emerged from broader cultural and social policy agendas. And I've demonstrated how these ideas of employing these terms have become a way of demonstrating value for money, even when this isn't the sort of language that the musicians themselves wouldn't have chosen in the first place. To finish, I want to leave us with a question. In knowing how much impact and influence these systems such as funders are appearing to have within the field, I want us to consider how far we are willing to be influenced in our work by the systems surrounding arts and cultural activity. Thank you very much for listening. And here is a bibliography of a number of texts that I have touched upon within this presentation. Thank you very much.